I wasn't listening to that. Thanks, Tony. Sorry, I was spending that doubtless lovely introduction being told how to move the slides on. So sorry about that. Yes, I hope what Tony said was I'm going to talk about Mick's views on metal detecting and how they changed over the years. You can all tell me what he actually said when I finished. Anyway, so Mick was pretty much in the mainstream of archaeological opinion on detecting, and so I think it's really worth looking at his views, not just to remember him as a thoughtful and open-minded and intelligent man, but also to look at the general trends in British archaeology over the years. As Tony said yesterday, when I first got to know Mick, he was quite vociferously against hobby metal detecting, and he had that in common with most archaeologists at the time. Now, I once worked for an organisation that wouldn't use a metal detector in any way at all, even though the project I was working on was designed to date ditches by trying to find bits of the ditch that we could section and find a find. You know, if we hadn't found a find, we couldn't date it. They would not use a metal detector because they said it wasn't that the machine itself wasn't useful. They said that it was if archaeologists used it, then it would legitimise the activity. So anyway, what was wrong with metal detecting and why was Mick against it? Well, the problem can be split into two parts, really. Firstly, archaeology wasn't supposed to be all about finds, and it certainly wasn't supposed to be about elite objects. Professional archaeologists in the 1970s seem to have spent a lot of time explaining to the general public, and in some cases older archaeologists, that all evidence was useful. Right, now I'm going to try and change the slide. Okay. Right. Yes, great. So a sequence of field boundaries and a heap of everyday rubbish, like here, discarded flint, pottery, animal bone, etc. All that was just as valid in reconstructing past societies as palaces and extremely rare and expensive objects with lovely art on them. In fact, during the 1970s, I feel that people might have gone a bit over the top with this. And I can remember respected professional archaeologists in the 1990s airily saying things like, oh, I don't know anything about finds, as if, you know, they'd never say anything like, oh, I don't know anything about ditch recuts. You know, they just wouldn't. They got rid of a whole class of evidence as not being as interesting as another class because it was not politically correct. So if you had to deal with finds, it was better to study flint and pottery, materials of the ordinary person, much better to look at those than the kind of glittery bits of gold and silver and bronze that perhaps distract the ill-informed. And of course, the metal detector could only find bits of metal. So in a way, it was politically suspect from the start. The second problematic aspect of the metal detector was its accessibility. And here we can see some marvellous pictures of the first metal detectors. Originally, they were developed after the First World War to find unexploded ordnance, and then they were improved during the Second World War when they were mainly used as mine detectors. And I have somewhere, but couldn't find, a lovely photograph of Group Captain Knocker, the famous archaeologist from Norfolk, with a huge rucksack on his back and a thing, and it says, Knocker using the mine detector, 1951. But sadly, it'll have to wait for another day because I've lost it. So there was some interest in them among archaeologists during the 1950s, but in the 1960s, they became available to everyone. They were even sold in shops, albeit specialist shops, and for a large amount of money. So they could be used now by anyone with no training and not necessarily any knowledge to find things. And the view among archaeologists, including Mick, was that people using detectors were out to find buried treasure. No doubt this was true in a lot of cases. But what worried them was that this buried treasure was obviously likely to be objects of archaeological interest. Now, you may think that these two little problems are contradictory. If the archaeologists of the 1970s felt that things like this were simply works of art that couldn't tell us that much from an archaeological point of view, why would we worry that ignorant or greedy members of the public might be digging them up? And the answer, of course, as always, is archaeological context. So these finds were all looted from their find spots. They originally, therefore, had no archaeological context at all, although retrospectively some vague find spot has been now worked out for all three, which is why I can label at least that one, the Icklingham bronzes. They're all marvellously beautiful. And because of the investment of ideas and iconography in their design and manufacture, to some extent, they are interesting in their own right. But how much more informative it would be, I mean, you can find out, there's a fantastic summary of the importance of archaeological context in the Salisbury Hoard book by Ian Stead. How much more informative it would be if we knew where they came from. In most cases of looted artefacts, we can be reasonably sure about the continent they came from, or simply from the evidence of the finds. But for Roman items, we can often only narrow it down to somewhere in Europe, Asia, or Africa, which isn't terribly helpful. It's always better to be certain about the country. If we knew which part of the country, even better. If we knew which field, we could do some research. We could do geophysics, we could do excavation, standard time team stuff. We could find out the context. We'd be able to find out whether it had been buried close to or within a building or in a very lonely place, far from anywhere. This next slide shows the work of the British Museum and Suffolk County Council and their volunteers, who are trying to work out and then hopefully research the find spot of the Mildenhall treasure, one of the stars of the Roman collection at the British Museum. And you might be aware of the story of the Mildenhall treasure, partly from the Roald Dahl book. But wouldn't it be great, so much better, if a find could be excavated still in context, using standard archaeological methods, like the Hoxton hoard shown here? We could perhaps find out how it had been arranged in the ground, whether it had been packed carefully, perhaps in straw in a box, or carelessly tossed into a hole, on the other hand. We could use pollen to show us what time of year it had been hidden. Stratigraphy would allow us to work out whether it had all been buried at once and then left alone, or whether the site had been revisited to maybe add bits or to take bits away, or both. Geophysics could give us the wider landscape context. Was it, as I said, buried somewhere where you could find it again, or was it buried in a remote place? Was there a ritual reason for it to be deposited there, like a watery place, or what? So, to return to the problem, if someone who is just interested in finding buried treasure and getting rich had a powerful tool that they could use to find archaeological objects, dig them up and take them away, that could be very destructive. And that is exactly what began to happen in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And archaeologists working in museums got to hear about things appearing in sale rooms which had clearly come directly from archaeological contexts. This slide shows a Coptic bowl made, you don't need to read any of that, so the fact that you can't doesn't matter, just bonhams and none of this says where it came from. It says something like from an old English collection. So these Coptic bowls are made in the 6th century in Alexandria. They're imported to Anglo-Saxon England, where they appear in high-status graves. So this is probably the one that was illegally excavated from a field in Saxingham Nethergate in Norfolk. And I first heard rumours about this object when I worked at Norwich Castle Museum 20 years ago. It kept appearing in the window of various antiquities shops. People kept saying, that Coptic bowl, you ought to go down to the shop on Elm Hill, it's in the window. I think it still may be kicking about in the trade. Very distressing to those of us who study things like this. And holes appeared in known archaeological sites, like this appalling situation at the Roman Temple of Wanborough in Surrey. It seems that a very large Iron Age coin hoard was stolen. I hope you can see the detail of this. It is actually an archaeological excavation with lots of holes and scoops minutely excavated. It was done after the event to find out what the damage was. Known archaeological sites were targeted because these were quite reasonably thought by detectorists to give them the best chance of finding something really exciting and valuable. So this was something new and threatening, and it was out of archaeologists' control, and it went against all the principles that had been painstakingly built up over the previous decade or two, that archaeology was a fragile and scarce resource that needed protection from the ignorant and to be investigated carefully, replacing that inevitable destruction with a very thorough record of everything that there was, not just the shiny metal finds. And so because of that, quite a lot of antagonism began. The STOP campaign was launched in 1980 by the Council for British Archaeology, and it was backed by all the main professional archaeological organisations of the day. And the list, if you can read it, is down there. If you can read that, you'll see that the preferred term for metal detectorists is treasure hunters. Here we go. The threat to Britain's archaeological heritage from treasure hunters. So in this atmosphere, you can imagine that most archaeologists would be against treasure hunting, especially those of a left-wing persuasion like Mick, who felt that the past belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford a metal detector and who had no scruples. But this campaign didn't stamp out the hobby. It actually tended more to entrench the two sides in their antagonism. And ironically, those treasure hunters also felt that the past belonged to everyone, not just those professionals who, so the detectorists said, wanted to rebury archaeological finds in cardboard boxes in museum basements where no one would ever see them again. So I think that really both sides felt that the other side was like a horrible dragon squatting on their ill-gotten gains. So that was the situation when I first met Mick professionally. Of course, I knew him from the Bristol day schools I'd been to when I was a teenager, but the first time I met him properly was at the second Time Team Live at Borsey in Norfolk. I found my first ever statesman on Time Team being interviewed by Carenza. This site had been identified as in need of research by the finds discovered by metal detectorists. And I was working with metal detectorists at the time, recording their finds at Norwich Castle Museum. So I went along to this excavation as a local digger and as an expert on the finds from the site. This project posed a bit of a problem for Mick. It was an ideal site for him in many ways. It was one of those island sites that seemed to be a Middle Anglo-Saxon monastery. It had a lot of signature finds from monasteries like Styley. But we had to talk about how it had been found. And Mick didn't want to be negative about the fact that the site had been discovered, but neither did he want to encourage more treasure hunting. Now, you may remember the footage of Tony and Mick in the Land Rover, but if not, I'm hoping that this slide will work.
You thought that we were going to start doing some metal detecting, but you used to loathe metal detectors, the great robbers of archaeology.
That's right, and that's still true to some extent. I mean, I think we have to see there's two sorts. There's metal detectorists who work with archaeologists on projects, and it's just another piece of equipment to record as much evidence as possible. And then there's that very, very small minority of what are really robber treasure hunters who are busy, pinching bits of our heritage and flogging them off.
Right, so I hope you heard that Mick said that if you worked with archaeologists on projects and it was just another piece of equipment to record as much evidence as possible, then that was fine. But the other type, a minority, were just interested in pinching bits of our heritage and flogging them off. Now, when I saw that, it felt a little bit incomprehensible to me because I'd been working with metal detectorists every day for a while, and I'd actually never met either of those types. In those days, there weren't many detectorists who worked on archaeological projects because they weren't usually welcome. And of course, those who were only interested in finding things and flogging them off didn't come into contact with museums much. So Borsey was when we had our first conversation about metal detecting. And one of the great things about Mick was that he was, people have stressed this over the whole weekend, he was always open-minded. He wasn't dogmatic, he didn't have sacred cows, and he wasn't embarrassed about changing his mind in public, which I think is a really rare thing, rare and wonderful thing. So even if he'd had an opinion for half his life, if you gave him a good argument, he would think about it, and if he agreed with you, he'd say so. He'd be the first to say, when facts change, I change my mind. And so what were the new facts that persuaded Mick to begin to modify his views? Well, the first one was when we began to understand agricultural erosion. Now I can't get there we go. There. Agricultural erosion. Oh, I hope you can see this slide. It used to be red, on the background, so it's obviously lost a bit of colour. I was first confronted by the reality of agricultural erosion when this collection was brought into me at Norwich Castle Museum. It had been found by a metal detectorist, but he hadn't needed to turn the machine on because he found these lying in rows on the top of the field. And we have Anglo-Saxon brooches of the kind that are found in women's graves, a bead there from a necklace. There is a bucket mount, buckets you'll be familiar with from Bremer, girdle hanger, these hang at the waist of an Anglo-Saxon woman. There's a girdle hanger up there. There we go. Men do occasionally get a look in the early Anglo-Saxon cemetery. We've got a sword pommel there, but otherwise men are pretty much invisible. That's why so many women work in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. Anyway, there you go. So all of these objects are of the kind that are buried in early Anglo-Saxon graves. They're all, as you can see, in extremely good condition. The site was actually a known early Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Oxborough in Norfolk. There had been occasional finds for years, presumably when slightly shallower graves had been hit by ploughing. Areas like this with sandy soil used for growing root crops, they erode slightly year by year by year as the wind blows the lighter bits of soil away and harvesting removes tiny amounts of soil. And what had happened here, though, was that the next crop was planned to be carrots, and so a de-stoner was sent through the field. These lift the stones out of the soil and leave them in rows on the top, so you can plant the carrots in between. This slide is not quite right, as it appears to be attempting to de-stone stone, but I hope you get the picture. Sadly, what had happened at Oxborough is that the de-stoner couldn't distinguish between stones and early Anglo-Saxon grave goods. All got gently raked out of their context, basically completely destroying the cemetery in one fell swoop. Now, experiences like that meant that I began to see that in the intensively farmed fields of East Anglia, it probably wasn't one person with their detector digging little holes that was doing most of the damage. It was mighty great agricultural machines smashing through the soil. Now, when things like this are excavated by archaeologists, they're almost always found in the graves of women, as I said, who are buried in their clothes and with their jewellery. And when we get, 5 or 10 brooches from a single field, we can be pretty sure that they've come from an early Anglo-Saxon cemetery. They usually date to the late 400 or 500s AD, so it's about 100 years or so after the end of Roman rule. Now, if you think about it, the early Anglo-Saxon lady concerned, and here is an example of one with some feet and some plough soil for scale. She'd have been buried at least 2 or 3 feet deep in the soil originally. I hope you can see that reconstruction. And she'd have been wearing these brooches on her shoulders at the bottom of the grave. So when the objects come into the topsoil and are hit by agricultural machinery, you can work out that the top of the subsoil has to be lowered by at least 2 feet. So we've lost these 2 stripes, essentially. Now, that might be through a combination of natural and man-made processes. It's not all man-made. There's things like deep ploughing and the harvesting of root crops and so on, but there's also wind and water erosion, soil creep down hillsides, and so on and so forth. It's not limited to Anglo-Saxon graves. We've got Dinnington Roman villa plough scars. That site will be familiar to you from 2 Time Team visits in 2002 and 2006. And I've coupled this with a picture of a ploughed field in Devon, just to show you the potential depth of topsoil that can be created by cultivation. Any shallowly buried archaeology in this does not stand a chance. And really what's frightening is this: we can tell what's going on when a detectorist finds a plough-smashed early Anglo-Saxon cemetery, because they find the artefacts and they come and tell us. But what else have we lost when the top of the subsoil has been lowered by 2 feet? Quite a lot of archaeological deposits, like prehistoric settlements, don't contain large amounts of pottery or metalwork. They can be very easily destroyed without trace. So the early Anglo-Saxon cemetery acts in areas that have them, like East Anglia, like a kind of miner's canary. They alert us to the fact that destruction is going on unseen. Of course, it's going on all the time anyway, but without the metal detectorists searching away in the arable fields and finding the evidence, it can carry on with no record. And the same sort of thing can be seen in aerial photographs. Here you can see crop marks from two sites that are familiar to Time Team viewers, Borsey up at the top and Sutton Courtenay. The effect that you can see is due to crops growing within archaeology. Generally, the clearer the crop mark, the less well preserved the archaeology, because cultivation is actively cutting into the site. Now, Sutton Courtenay's crop marks were actually visible from ground level. Gosh, I hope you can see this. I can just about see it there and going up there. I did get into a cherry picker to take this picture, but we only knew to climb up in the cherry picker because you could literally see it if you put your head over the hedge. There's also chemical damage, another aspect of agricultural damage that we can be alerted to. This is an Iron Age horse bit from Norfolk, found by a farmer in a bullock yard, apparently. Has never been in plough soil. Here's another picture of it, together with something that was originally similar, but this was found on arable land near Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, and there the sandy soil makes it impossible to grow crops without a lot of chemicals, and you can see what the chemicals do to the object. So another thing that was changing at this time was the relationship between archaeologists and metal detectorists. And again, the pioneering place for this was Norfolk. Norfolk had one of the very first sites and monuments records. This was set up in 1946, and it had always included stray finds, because by that point they hadn't been what you might call tainted, either by political correctness or by association with metal detectorists. So when detectorists began bringing their finds in the late 1960s, staff at Norwich Castle Museum saw no difference in the importance of something that had been found just with the eye on the one hand, or with a detector on the other. They all needed recording. Now, in 1974, Tony Gregory, who apparently never learnt to do buttons up, was appointed as Assistant Keeper of Archaeology at Norwich Castle Museum, and he became the main point of contact for metal detectorists. And he quickly realised that it was better to work with detectorists than against them, because if they knew where they had found something, if they could be encouraged to be more systematic in their searching, and if they could be persuaded to keep their eyes open for flint and pottery too, then the information that they brought in would be much more useful. So he began running courses, including basic archaeological techniques like how to work out where you are. But he died in 1991 at the age of 42, another of those huge losses to archaeology. But by this time, the idea of the portable antiquities scheme had begun to develop. And this started as a side effect of needing to change the ancient law of treasure trove. Now, that seems to have been invented by King John, bad King John. And it said that the only archaeological finds which could be claimed by the Crown, therefore legally saved for the nation, were items of precious metal that had been buried with the intention of recovery. So in effect, those were always hoards, because anything else was generally, and probably correctly, thought to be mainly an accidental loss, and so not deliberately buried with the intention of recovery. And that had become a big problem, because prehistorians had been saying for years that many hoards were in fact ritual deposits buried for posterity and not with the intention of recovery. But at coroner's inquests, all these prehistorians had to perjure themselves and say on oath that no, it had been buried with the intention of recovery. Definitely somebody was going to come back and get it, because otherwise the museum wouldn't be able to claim them. And this is getting more and more awkward, and it was felt that one day an expert witness would finally tell the truth in court, and then the game would be up. Anyway, I was going to tell you about another problem, base metal Roman coins, but I won't. Those are not treasure, were not treasure trove, rather. Treasure Act, I don't have time to go through that. It is very interesting, honestly, but it will have to wait for another day. Anyway, suffice to say, we got this new law. It extended the new status of treasure to all these things, all objects of gold or silver over 300 years old, all coin hoards. Later extended to all prehistoric hoards, and anything found with treasure is still treasure. Anyway, this definition wasn't going to please everyone. Who says that gold, silver and hoards are so important? What about things like these? Aren't they just as important too? Yes, of course, but it's a problem of definition and resources. We need to be able to draw black and white lines in law, and we couldn't possibly afford to have a mandatory reporting system for all archaeological finds. So we got instead a voluntary system of reporting non-treasure finds, and that was set up to support the Treasure Act, and that became the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Over the next 6 years, this was gradually extended so that by 2003, we had a network of staff covering the whole of the country, including me. At one point, I was this little yellow cross there in Suffolk. The Treasure Act has another aspect which often annoys archaeologists, though. It pays finders and landowners a reward equal to the market value of the object or objects found. And that is to act as an incentive to the finder to report the objects, not to sell them on the black market. They won't lose out by reporting the find. But in some situations, this turned out to be, well, to look very unfair from the archaeologist's point of view. And the example here, ironically, is at Shapwick. Teresa Hall found a single Roman coin at Shapwick while field walking. Teresa is a demon field walker and can find anything. Then metal detectorists visited that very field, and of course they found a buried hoard of over 9,000 denarii, Roman silver coins, ranging in date from 32 BC to 224 AD, and it was the largest hoard of Roman denarii ever found in Britain. And it was, as was regrettably extremely common at that time, which was 1998, entirely removed by the detectorists, despite the fact that there had been a major archaeological project going on in the village for years. The whole place was heaving of archaeologists. They still dug it out and put it in a bucket, or several buckets, of course. Now, understandably, Somerset Museum wanted to claim the hoard, and so they had to pay the reward. And the hoard was valued at £265,000. I checked this with Chris. I said, is it true that that amount of money would have covered the fundraising for the whole Shapwick project? And he said, yeah, pretty much. And so Mick saw that money handed on a plate to people who had acted apparently unethically. So the difficulty is that we have to educate metal detectorists not to act unethically. And of course, that's totally true to Mick's principles. He, as much as anybody else, wanted to train metal detectorists who had an interest in the past to become archaeologists. But I think we all, me and Mick included, underestimated the scale of the task. Now, somebody like Mick always was ploughing a bit of a lonely furrow in adult education. At Bristol, he was trying to educate an entire region all on his own. In contrast, the PAS has ended up with 30 staff across the whole country, paid for by a combination of central and local government money. We record finds, but we also do outreach and education, and we've now been nationwide for 15 years. You need to have a critical mass of educators. You can't do it alone. Now, what have we done? We've encouraged the use of GPS. We've trained hundreds of volunteers to identify and record finds. We've got them all buying and reading books. We've got them all learning about the past, as well as being able to spot a Colchester one-piece brooch or a continental pollard or whatever. But I think that Mick would agree that we still haven't managed to get everyone up to the gold standard of local landscape research. So most detectorists still don't add systematic field walking to their research methods. They have virtually no sampling strategies, hardly anybody haunts the local record office, and the lure of possible money is high, although we constantly stress that finds of treasure that attract large rewards are extremely rare. Now, those are generalizations. I don't want to suggest that no detectorist field walks, no detectorist is systematic or visits a library, just that the ones that do are still in a minority, where there are changes happening all the time. Last year, an association of detectorists was formed. They're working towards becoming an institute of detectorists to do exactly what Mick wanted, to embed detectorists within archaeological projects. And they're starting off with courses. But something else that changed over the years to make Mick slightly more friendly to metal detecting was simply the extra information that you could wring out of a site by using a metal detector. When I joined Time Team, there were occasional detectorists on the local digging team, but pretty soon this developed into a standard 2 or 3 on every project, and the range of finds broadened. These two examples, both from Codner Castle, were pretty amazing, both from the moat. Now, the gold noble is nice. It's an exciting find, but we know quite a bit about these already. The lead spindle whorl, on the other hand, I'm afraid this isn't actually a photograph of the exact one because I couldn't find a photograph of that, but this one's very similar. That was the first relief-decorated lead spindle whorl to be found in a dated context. Given that before that we weren't sure if they were Roman or medieval, that little discovery really was a step forward. That's enabled us to add dates to a whole lot of things. But it's since the end of Time Team, really, that metal detecting has begun to help in a big way, and that is partly through being combined with geophysics. They are obviously very similar techniques, but metal detecting can give you spot dates to inform the spatial results of the geophysics. So it really adds another dimension. I hope you can see this. This is dating a Roman site by the dates of the coins combined with the geophysics. All the spots have disappeared off that one, but that's an Iron Age site. And don't forget that all this has come from metal objects in the topsoil. And to think, we used to strip off that topsoil and chuck it away, or at the very least, we'd pile it up and then back in without any further investigation. And that always used to annoy detectorists, who ironically saw it as unnecessary destruction of the archaeological record by archaeologists. Anyway, lastly, but most importantly, Mick obviously appreciated the contribution of metal detected finds to landscape archaeology. And as the Portable Antiquities scheme began to record more and more, we began to see that that data was not just another way of telling us what we knew already, it was something subtly different. And we had, for example, a surprising number of these medieval seal matrices. You probably know all about these already. They're small metal objects used to, they've got an engraved design and mirror image on them, and you press that into hot wax to make a seal for a document. These two are very representative of what we record on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database. We've now got over 5,500 of them, and rather remarkably, like this one, about 1 in 5 are the seals of women. Seal of Matilda Johnson there. They're very rare finds on archaeological sites, though, because they don't make their way into rubbish. And in the immortal title of Mick and Tony's book, Archaeology is rubbish. In fact, it's only largely rubbish. It's not completely rubbish. These were accidental losses of important and perhaps much loved objects. Accidental loss is higher in lonely areas. And when travelling, because you're moving on, you don't come back and you don't recover your object. Metal detecting is the best way to find these small forgotten objects that are kind of at loose in the landscape, which means that we can now find all sorts of sites and activities that we could never find before. So accidental loss is the best way, and in some cases the only way, to identify sites like markets and fairs or battlefields. Sites that have little or no subsoil features. There just aren't buildings, there aren't post holes, there aren't ditches. There's nothing else to show up on the geophysics or in excavation. So we can add whole new classes of site to our landscape, thanks to metal detecting. Projects including metal detected data that I think Mick would have liked included, oh dear, they include this pilot scheme on which is trying to get funding to look at medieval markets, and a PhD done by Adam Daubney, one of our members of staff in Lincolnshire, which is looking at long-term change. This shows the early and middle Anglo-Saxon data around the monasteries of the Witham Valley. So I think that's Bardney. And of course, what makes this even better is that a lot of this research can be done by amateurs. The PAS database is live on the internet. You can do, as Stuart was saying, this attracts people who want to do research but perhaps can't get out and about. You can do a lot of your research at home. There are no gatekeepers to the PAS database if all you want is basic data, and we're very friendly if you want to know more, including things like the level of find spot you want to look at. So it's ideal for the kinds of volunteers, the kinds of amateurs who find it difficult to access traditional archaeology. And then 20 years after Borsey, DigVentures are now I'm sure that wasn't that shape, that slide, when I originally did it, but you can get the picture. They're now excavating sites identified by metal detecting, one at Elmswell in East Yorkshire. And I think it's very brave to do this, because Time Team never had a lot of success in characterising these sites. And when you think about it, that's exactly what you would expect. This kind of new evidence won't necessarily point us in directions we understand, or even in directions we recognise, until we start looking at them. And it's sad that Mick isn't here to see this new work, because we're now beginning to use metal detected evidence to protect archaeology that's still in the plough soil. We're using it to learn more about sites such as monasteries and markets, and trackways is another one. We are managing to train more and more people in archaeological principles and give them the tools to do their own research. But what I feel is that that if we take Mick's memory with us and we use his enthusiasm to inspire us, we know that at least everybody doing this work is standing on the shoulders of a giant, really. That's where I'll leave it. Thank you.